Hey, what's up, everyone? I'm talking to Simon of uh, Nightmare. How are you doing, Simon?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for talking to me. And again, fan of Nightmare. The new Nightmare album, Deformity Adrift, will be coming out on May 5th, and that'll be released through Total Dissonance Worship Records.
Yeah, that's
All right.
correct.
Yeah, I understand you run Total Dissonance Worship Records.
Yeah, I started the label in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, basically.
Yeah, yeah. So you're going on like 3 years now.
Exactly. Yeah, three very turbulent years.
Yeah. How like kind of where did you or how did you get the idea of starting Total Distance and Worship?
Well, I think a couple of factors kind of came together. First of all, we put out our first album on Season of Mist, and we were kind of feeling like we wanted to try doing things DIY for several reasons. I think one main reason for me was that in, 1.5 decades of putting out music through um, renowned metal labels, I never got a royalty check for any sales, right? I literally made zero. Um, Obviously, those labels helped in other ways, getting you on, by extension, getting you on tours and whatnot. But generally speaking, it was just very frustrating especially for a band like Nightmare that isn't necessarily always heavily looking to tour. We do want to tour, we like touring, but we're not like a band that's trying to play 150 shows a year or whatever. So at the end of the day, you're looking at when you're signed to a label like that, you're not able to monetize anything other than touring. And so that became kind of frustrating after a while. And so at first, Total Distance Worship was mainly supposed to be a vehicle to release just Nightmare and also re-release some stuff from my old band. But then the pandemic hit, and I was, sitting there with all of this, time on my hands to a certain degree, right? And I was just like, well, let me just talk to a couple of bands that I liked, and or sometimes I would just stumble over like an old record I really liked, and I realized, hey, this isn't even on streaming services or whatever. You can't get this anywhere in digital shape, and so I would just hit up those bands, and be like, hey, let me help put this stuff at least on streaming services. I think more people should, be able to listen to this. And yeah, it started with a couple of older albums really that I thought were just missing. And then it just kind of spiraled from there. And then in late 2020, I put out my first tape release, and it just kept going from there. And here we are with, tape and vinyl and digital releases and everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Just kind of going and listening to some of the bands on Total Distance Worship, there is kind of a distinct, unique sound. Uh, how do you, or I guess, like, how do you go about, like, getting these bands on your record label, or is there like a certain style you look for, or is it just some based on your personal taste?
I would say it's mostly based on my personal taste, but it is curated towards a very specific niche of my personal taste, right? So, as the name suggests, I'm mainly looking to work with dissonant extreme metal bands or whatever. And of course, that's not all I listen to, but it's I think the thing that I'm most passionate about, and also like as a musician and as a fan, and also it obviously fits very well with what Nightmare do. So I kind of figured it would be a cool way to create this very curated indie boutique label around that specific niche of extreme metal. And so sometimes I venture outside of it a little bit, but most of the time it's dissonant extreme metal, black metal, death metal, grindcore, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned tapes and records. I have a couple here. I got the
Oh,
Trabalist tape, and then uh,
oh yes,
uh,
Imperial
yeah,
Triumphant.
Imperial Triumphant, and then the Ad Nauseum.
Very cool.
Um, And then as far as the records, I picked up the new Nightmare as a pre-order.
Excellent.
And the only one I have is this one,
Oh yeah,
Defacement.
Defacement. That's an excellent album.
Yeah. I noticed you don't have CDs. Like, do you have any interest or
Well, so
plans for CDs?
we have had just a handful of CD releases. We did CDs for Vitriol's Antichrist EP. That was mainly vinyl, but we did CDs. The band wanted CDs. But most of those CDs went straight to the band to sell on tour. And I think I only kept maybe 50 in stock for the shop. And what else? Morse Verum was another band I put out on CD. The experience I've had with CD is I actually literally asked my, customers, hey, do you still buy CDs, or who still buys CDs, and kind of made a poll. And the overwhelming majority said, yes, we do. And then I put out a handful of CD releases and they really just didn't move. And to the point where the digital sold way more than the CD. If there were other formats available than CD, those would sell way better. So it's just kind of like, it's just for some reason, it's for me, for Total Dissonance Worship, it's the most difficult format to actually sell. For the Nightmare album, we also, for the new one, we also did CD, and those are going pretty well. But generally speaking, I think the more underground the bands are, I feel like the more nichey the formats have to be for people to get excited about it. So, tape or vinyl, rather than CD. Maybe CD is a medium that sells best on tour, I guess, right? So yeah, it's just my experience with CD releases has just been pretty underwhelming all in all. So I don't do them very often.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I grew up like in the late, well, when I started like collecting albums, it was more like in the early 2000s. So that was
Right.
like, CDs were everywhere. So I still collect CDs, and but that's cool though. I mean, I still like dig like I guess mainly, if not CD, I like to try to get the record, but
Yes.
usually it has to be for me like an album that I know I'm gonna listen to on like a speaker system that's gonna carry.
Yeah.
It's gonna sound good like when I'm like listening to it on a speaker system. If it's like too like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. Like if it's like super technical, like death metal or grindcore, I tend to just get the CD because I know I'm just going to listen to it like, in the car or on like I don't know. Yeah, it just depends on like how I feel like the sound will carry. Like either will it be good like on a like headphone or like on a speaker system. Um
Yeah, I could definitely relate to that. I think sometimes it also really depends on how an album is produced. I also, technical death metal being a great example. If the music is produced very, and I'm not using it as a negative term, but like in a more sterile and very, like almost futuristic way, I don't know if vinyl is always the format that really benefits that kind of style. And I kind of like to think of it as if the production is a bit more raw or maybe a bit more organic and warmer, I think that carries over well with vinyl. But sometimes I'm just really surprised. I mean, I put out an album by the New Zealand band Blindfolded and Led to the Woods, and their production is very modern. The music is quite technical. For some reason, it sounded phenomenal on vinyl. It was just one of those things where it just came out. It's literally one of the best like sounding records even in my personal collection. Something just hit right, so you can never say for sure, but for the most part, I would agree that very technical and futuristic sounding productions aren't necessarily the first thing I would think about with vinyl in mind.
yeah. You recently put out a was a choir
Yes.
last month, and then you got Nightmare coming up next month. Are there other releases that you have planned for the remainder of the year?
Yeah, so I have a couple more tape releases in the pipeline. And then the rest of the year, I'm gonna have to focus a little bit more on a couple of reissues and represses of what I would say are genre essentials. Last year I did a repress of a Convulsing album, for example, and that sold really well and people still want it. So there's going to be another one. We're also repressing Convulsing's first album. I'm going to be doing more represses for Ion Dissonance, and then there will also be a Beneath the Massacre vinyl pressing of which is the first time vinyl pressing of their first EP. So it's just that the landscape has changed a lot in the last 3 years. In 2020 and 2021, physical sales were phenomenal. And, I think a couple of factors played into that. The pandemic, people who didn't lose their income weren't able to spend as much money outside on, going out to eat, going to events, all of that kind of fell through. And there was this like new found appreciation for physical releases, and people just bought stuff like crazy. And then as of 2020, costs have gone up again. We are not in any sort of lockdown, so we're starting and events are happening, so people are spending their money elsewhere again, and it's created this dynamic where it almost feels a little bit like the bubble of the last 2 years burst a little bit. So you always kind of have to be on your toes a little bit and see what works at any given moment. And right now I feel like reissues are still doing pretty well, but sometimes, like, last year I released a lot of really underground stuff, like bands that either didn't exist before or people just didn't know about, and it's always a big gamble, and it's always small run vinyl, so it's very expensive to do. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But in order to also keep the label afloat, sometimes you have to pivot a little bit, and that's what I'm doing for the rest of the year for the most part. So there will be a lot of reissues, but it's also stuff that I'm still very excited about as a fan, because those things informed my music taste, over the last 2 decades. So I'm not like less excited about it. It's just a little bit of a different approach this year, and I hope that things balance out a little bit again, and people are more excited about physical on a broader scale in the next couple months.
Okay. And then we could talk about your new album for Nightmare, Deformity Adrift, that's going to come out May 5th.
Yes.
I got a chance to check it out. I got the promo sent and was listening to it last night and this morning. And it's just, if people out there like dissonant, like super like low tune, like, atmospheric death metal, like, definitely pick it up. I mean, I forgot to ask, what are your thoughts on like streaming platforms? Like, do you see any like drawbacks or benefits from the streaming platforms?
I think it's a little bit of both. Generally speaking, I think one issue they have created is that, especially newer generations are not used to having to spend money on, or maybe are not used to the idea of owning the music that they're a fan of. So I think the way that, fans will consume music going forward will tilt more and more towards streaming services. So we'll have to see how that works for, especially underground arts that kind of rely on financing themselves by being able to sell physical releases. I guess it's a good vehicle for people to, sometimes just stumble over your music because it's recommended, or it's in like, it's like artist of so-and-so also listen to so-and-so. So I think there's like a discovery element to it for sure, but I think that will also diminish over time because there's just so much music being released that it's going to be impossible at some point for a lot of bands to even cut through the noise at all anymore. So I think it's a mixed bag all in all.
Okay. But I mean, if people out there listening want to check it out, definitely stream it, but I would recommend like, just getting the physical copy. So for the new album, I was just curious, this is the second album by Nightmare, and then you also put out an EP 2 years ago, I believe.
Yes.
And so with your guitar sound, how how did you kind of create that, or was there like a specific like band or artist that kind of really like influenced you to create your guitar sound?
So generally speaking, so way back in the day, I was like a really big Meshuggah fan, with like Chaos Fear, for example. And then I remember when they put out Nothing, and that was the first time they kind of used that super low tuning. At first, I really didn't like it. It was like a weird sound to me, and it took me a while to warm up, until, well, the IEP was really impressive, and then Catch 33 I thought was really great. So I would say, generally speaking, that many years ago, that made me try a tuning kind of like there. So we're basically playing the same guitar tuning as Meshuggah, just on baritone 7 strings, because 8-string guitars are pretty cumbersome, not that much fun to play. So that was kind of, I think, one of the initial bands that made me want to try it. But I always kind of gravitated towards lower tunings, Morbid Angel being an example, Gorguts being an example. Those are all bands that tuned low. Ion Dissonance, I already mentioned them, where I think for a while, one of the only bands that played really dissonant and like chaotic, grindy music while also using a really low tuning. And I remember one of the first tours of my old band, we played a couple of shows with Ion Dissonance, and it was just I was just so intrigued by what they were doing. So I think that's kind of where that came from. And honestly, like, I usually so we recorded most of the album ourselves, and for this album we did use a Kemper, which is a profiling amp that allows you to hook it up to a tube amp and then basically recreate a digital version of that. And so every tone that we used came from from a tube amp that we profiled ourselves. The interesting thing about the Kemper is, my experience with super low tunings is, if you try to pull that off just with a tube amp, you kind of run into some roadblocks. It's kind of hard for a tube amp to stay really tight in the low end once you tune that low. And the interesting thing that the Kemper allows you is to basically take that tube amp tone, but then manipulate it within the Kemper in a lot of ways, where you can apply a lot of extra EQing and whatnot, and kind of shape the tone towards something that works better with that low tuning. And that's basically what we have done, and what we have used for this album and the previous album as well. But yeah, it's just like I don't know if we're going to use the Kemper again next time. Right now I'm experimenting with a lot of pedals and different stuff. So there's always like a tone chasing element with both our other guitarist Keith and I, and we enjoy tinkering a lot. So I think that'll be more reflected on our future outputs. But also, when we wrote this album, I still lived in Florida. Keith lived here in Portland, Oregon, which is where I moved to in the meantime. So it was kind of like a patchwork production, so to speak. It was written in many different places, it was recorded in many different places. The drums were recorded in Berlin, Germany. So it was like all over the place. So we also kind of had to use something like the Kemper, like a more digital kind of setup. So we were able to basically work across different studios and be able to fuse everything in a homogeneous way, so to speak.
Yeah, no, like I said, I dig it. I mean, everyone should check it out. This is the second album from Nightmare. What would you say were some like, changes that you guys made or tweaked, or any new like elements you guys incorporated for this new album?
So I think there's one major difference between those two albums, and that one is that the first album took 3.5 years to write, and this album took 3.5 weeks to write. So what happened was, the first album was, it came out of of our drummer and my's old band, and we were kind of trying to reinvent ourselves without completely changing styles. Our old band already was low tuned and very dissonant. So it took a long time to find our sound. And I think what happened with the first album is that it's a very homogenous album, and you hear some hints here and there of different influences, but it's just like, we mulled over every part for years, basically, until we arrived at this very homogeneous result. And this time around, it was a more spontaneous process. And what that resulted in is that some of those influences that were just subtle notes maybe on our first album, we just dove into way more this time. So the first music video we put out for the song Taufbefehl, that features the Valborg vocalists, that is a pretty consequential industrial song, basically. And when we wrote that song, that was the intent behind it. We're just like, okay, this is an influence of ours, and rather than just weaving it into a part on a song, let's make an entire song that pays tribute to that. And so there are elements across this album, or moments across this album, where we were just more obvious with our influences, rather than trying to interweave everything in this big soundscape, which we still do in other songs. But yeah, I would say there's more of that, and that makes the album a bit more diverse to listen to than the first album.
Yeah, like I said, it's just an amazing album. Definitely everyone should check it out.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then I just want to kind of talk about, like, just record collecting.
Right.
I mean, I like to collect records, and I know at the end of the year I like to post records with the vinyl challenge.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's super fun. I always look forward to it.
Awesome.
Yeah, I was just curious, like, what's like your most sought after, or if you already have it, like, what's your most like treasured record in your collection?
It's kind of hard to say. I would say one of the things that I'm really, really happy that I got a hold of for a reasonable price too, because I missed the initial release, is Inferno Coil's Within a World Forgotten. There is a wooden box set that they did, and I love that album. It's one of my favorite albums, favorite extreme metal albums. And when that box set came out, they shipped it in a mailer full of leaves, which is really cool, dried leaves. And it's just like, I feel like a lot of thought went into creating an experience with that box set. And sadly, I missed it. I found out about it literally a week after it went on sale and sold out very fast. So 2 years down the line, I found it on Discogs for a not outrageous price. And the cool thing was that the seller even still had the box with the leaves that it shipped in originally. So he put it back into that box and then shipped it to me. And I got the entire experience out of it, which was really awesome. So that is definitely a release that I'm very, very happy to have. I think one thing that has happened in the last couple of years is that for a while there were those like holy grails that were really hard to come by. And now most labels have, realized the potential, especially with legacy releases, that, hey, we can repress this and make a lot of money. And so I think nowadays it's easier to find albums that used to be holy grails, to find them on vinyl again, because they are being repressed, and most of the time on more spectacular looking vinyl than ever. So yeah, there are definitely a couple of things that were really hard to track down and that I waited for years, only for them to be reissued at some point. But I'm not mad at it. It doesn't matter. If it's like if it's a release I care about, I'm stoked that it gets repressed, and I hope the band is able to make some money off of it finally, sometimes after 20 years. And that was my approach when I repressed, when I pressed Ion Dissonance's debut album for the first time. We pressed 1,000 copies and they practically sold out. And I was able to, after 20 years after its original release, to sent the band a nice check, you know, and I was just happy for the band to make money off of something that was that happened 20 years ago and that I'm just passionate about as a fan. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, for me, I like the band Exhumed, and then the album Anatomy is Destiny. That thing's like over $200 on Discogs. I'm still hoping they repress it and I can get it really cheap.
That was
But,
a sick album. I remember
yeah.
I remember hearing it for the first time and I was like super hooked on it. Fun fact, Leon Del Muerte, who played for Exhumed for a while, literally lives a mile away from me, and we hang out sometimes. We just went out this weekend, and so yeah, it's very, very familiar with it.
But I think that's the end of my time though. So thanks again,
All right.
Simon. Really appreciate it. And hope
Yeah,
everyone,
likewise.
checks out the new album coming out May 5th. All right.
Yeah. Appreciate
Thanks.
your time, and have a good one.
You too.
Bye.